So you want to know the number one reason your communications suck. Well, you've got to say that communications is something that you have to fall in love with to begin with. So you could say that the reason your communications suck is because you haven't fallen in love with communications, but that's not what we're going to say. What we're going to say is that your communications suck because you don't know how to identify the problem. Identifying the problem is the number one thing you need to do. Sometimes the other person is the problem. Just the other person's behaviour, the way the other person communicates with you, the way the other person is could be the problem. But if they're actually trying to get a problem solved and you don't identify the problem, this is the number one reason your communications suck. Because you cannot find the thing that they have wrong in order to fix it, then you suck at communications if you do not identify the problem first. Identifying the problem is the number one thing you need to do in order to be able to communicate effectively. If the other person is the problem, for example, bullies, you don't have a choice. Yet you just have to keep quiet and let the bully run out of steam and then try to identify the problem. But if you're not with a bully on the telephone or in communications, then what you need to do is find a way to identify the problem. Ask them probing questions, open and closed questions, like, for example, is the TV working? Yes or no? Yes, it's working. Okay, what channel specifically isn't working? Oh, well, there's many channels not working. Okay, can you identify which channels, some of those channels, which they are, please? Identify the problem. Then you will be able to get your communications right. Until you identify the problem the person has, you're not solving anything. So your communications just completely suck. And that's the way it is with communications. I found that working in a call centre that people's communications sucked because they just couldn't identify the problem. There was people calling in, and it was the third or fourth time calling in, and they were getting really angry. And the person couldn't identify the problem was that they needed to be passed on to another department. And that this was the reason that they weren't getting their problem solved. Now, transferring them on to the other department would have created a situation where the person on the telephone had to find the real problem, which the real problem was they needed to be transferred to another department, but they were finding the problem was solvable at this department, and that was not the case. So if you cannot identify if you cannot identify the problem, you cannot do communications. You cannot communicate at all. You cannot communicate with anyone if you're not able to identify the exact problem there is and then try to solve the problem. Identify the problem and then find a solution. This is the number one reason your communications suck. Now, I found that with bullies are an example of somewhere where you're not going to get anywhere with identifying the problem because the bully just wants to bully you. Now, that's not an example we can use. We're using an example of people who really want to have a problem solved and they're going to identify the problem for you. With a bully, they're not going to identify the problem for you, so you're just safer letting it go and letting it whiz on by you and keeping quiet and then trying to identify the problem once they've run out of steam. Now, you've learned today what the number one problem with your communications is. And this number one problem needs solving right away. Right away, you need to know why your communications suck. And your communications suck because you cannot identify the problem at hand. If you cannot identify the problem at hand, you are not communicating effectively because you are not communicating the solution. And people want solutions to their problems. Once you've identified the solution, then you can say that you've done it properly. You've done it properly and you can't communicate any more effectively. The way to communicate effectively is to identify the problem first, to identify the source of the problem, to identify the exact problem, whether you have to ask 100 questions to get to the bottom of the problem. You cannot communicate effectively until you've identified that problem. So there's the number one reason your communications suck.